First of all, the title. I think it's a great title. There are three words that get me going: murder, Orient, and Express. They seem very clever to combine those three. I remember reading it and admiring how many characters she used, and I felt that that was a smart way of keeping the audience guessing, and she choreographs that very well. I loved the evocation of the golden age of travel. I wanted to get onto that train. I liked the winter setting, so in December. We have the chance of a sort of an arc for the character that takes us from a man who, at the beginning of the story, says there is right, there is wrong, there is nothing in between, all the way through to a moment where, when we know who and how and why, we then have to consider, well, is there something in between? He's a moral absolutist, and his obsessions, if you like, what he calls his little originalities, they're less the behaviors of a sort of a dandy, and more of a sort of obsessive, compulsive individual, so that when those eggs are not the same size, or when that hotel room is an odd number, not an even number, these things almost pain him. Disharmony and imbalance are things that can, produce a collapse. So when he comes up against something that he ought to have a solution to, and he asks the question, where does conscience lie? It makes for a kind of chewy moral issue. The key to the casting was Judi Dench. Judi Dench was the first person I asked, and she was the first person to say yes before I finished the sentence where I asked her. But once she was on board, she became a kind of magnet. Someone like Johnny Depp worships Judi, absolutely worships it. When they all came together for the first time, literally physically together, they were going to do their first scene, and they were outside the steps of the dining car. And I was on the dining car, and I saw them. They were all very shy with each other, very sort of awestruck, bizarrely enough. And Michelle Pfeiffer was the first person to come up the steps onto the carriage. So I said hello, and I noticed there were tears in her eyes. I thought, Christ, what's happened? I said, are you all right? She said, I just met Judi Dench. I feel so emotional. As to the moustache, took a few months of realizing the brutal truth. I could not grow that moustache. I have neither the follicle power nor the chemical hormonal combination to produce the sort of double handlebar swirl that my friend Carol Hemming designed. So we spent the following few months sticking things on me and using a bust of me, and we must have had 11 versions of that thing. Agatha Christie said, you referred to them in the novels, as she said in the plural, he wore the most magnificent moustaches in England. So the idea was to produce this kind of mask, his superpower, if you like, which he hides behind and he observes people through, and almost his greatest delight is for people to dismiss him. Mary Debenham, Daisy Ridley's character, says in the novel, he was a perfectly ridiculous little man, the sort of man with that moustache that you could not take seriously. And when people do not take Poirot seriously, he has a chance to watch and observe and be a better detective. Well, it's a good question. It's one we had to answer early on, and I'm familiar with it because having come from the classical theatre. I mean, for instance, last year I directed a production of Romeo and Juliet, and most people know what happens at the end. Romeo and Juliet don't make it. Sorry, that's a spoiler alert. I sort of said, forgive me if I've ruined your experience of Shakespeare, but in this case, addressing it, we did make some changes. So the book begins in Syria, in Aleppo. The 74 movie begins with a flashback of the Armstrong murder. And we begin in Jerusalem at the Wailing Wall with the idea of presenting Poirot in action with a denouement to another case. And I remember reading and thinking that when the policeman runs and gets himself caught on that cane, that was a very pleasing example of Poirot being a little ahead of us, and that already that might make the audience start to feel, oh, so that's not what we're used to. Plus, he himself is a little more active, and we're in a different place. And so to do that early, I think, was important.